Originally, I didn't want to have to make this video, but in lieu of recent events, I felt that it was important to talk about the fact that we have a potential for very dangerous times ahead of us, and we need to be very aware of what's going to be happening here moving forward. We're going to talk about things that happened 20 years ago, especially on that particular day that changed the face of this country forever, and why they apply to today's recent situations that make a more vulnerable scenario for those of us in the preparedness community. We need to understand that everything's lining up in a certain way that could cause us a lot of problems here very soon. And I'm trying to get this message out to everybody as best I can because I'm very concerned with where we're heading. So we're going to talk about what has happened in the past, what just recently happened, and where we're going to be heading, which in my opinion looks to be much more dangerous. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and today we're talking about an important message. We need to prepare for things to become more dangerous because of the direction everything is headed. And I want to discuss some different events throughout the last 20 years that have led us down this path and why we need to be concerned about ourselves here in the preparedness community specifically. And if you're worried about how to prepare for what's coming next, then hit the subscribe button below. Because honestly, I'm gonna try my best to keep these messages coming for as long as I can before it becomes something I'm no longer able to do, as we can all see eventually happening on the horizon. Understand that these recent mandates that have been put out definitely have crossed a certain line of no return. And are we at the point of no return? The best analogy might be that we have, as a country, recently jumped the shark, which means the show will never be the same again. And the only way to turn this show back around and make it into what it used to be is to have a formal reboot that takes the original concepts and ideas that made this show really great and brings them back to the forefront once again. And unfortunately, we have definitely crossed that line at this point, as predicted by many of us here in the preparedness community. But there's a lot of other things that layer into this whole conversation that make things so dangerous for us specifically based on what's been put out there in the sense of mainstream media and from the federal government. So we need to talk about all of that. So the first thing we're going to talk about are these new mandates that are coming from the federal government, specifically the executive branch, and why this is such a situation that we have to be worried about, okay? The new mandates in place basically require that businesses with over 100 employees, any federal entity or federal contractors, which there are millions of, any healthcare workers, and also any large venues, including concert halls or sports arenas, all require the proof that we all know is being talked about right now. And that proof is going to either be utilized through some kind of a medical history, or it will be utilized in the sense of receiving a negative confirmation, okay? We're using certain verbiage here to try to get this message out as far as we possibly can. Okay, so obviously, we saw this coming. We knew this push was going to come, and it has demonized a huge section of the population that has not complied with some of these regulations or mandates as of yet. And all those decisions are personal decisions to be made. And one thing I want to make very clear is that, at least on my channel, I've never been pro or anti any particular situation involving the subject matter we're talking about right now. I am pro the concept of personal choice when it comes to these decisions being made. And that is something we must maintain to keep our freedom and our individuality intact. And that is something that's being taken away from us right now, even if it's not directly to us as a human being. It's being taken away from us in alternative ways that makes it seem less invasive, I guess you might say, because there's still other options. But we all know what's really happening here, okay? So, in a video I recently put out, I said prepare for mandates, but not from who you think. And I said that the mandates weren't going to come from the federal government, they were going to come from the private sector, and that the federal government figured out that the private sector was the best way to implement these mandates. Now, I didn't necessarily expect the federal government, in the sense of the executive branch, to come out and literally put these mandates in place specifically for the private sector, but that is what they did. And like I said in that past video, that was their best line of thought. That was their best, path towards trying to accomplish what it is they wanted to do. And obviously they took that route. Now, here's something you need to consider, okay? And it's something that hasn't really been discussed very much. But 11.8 million PPP loans were given out since 2020, which were loans designed for businesses to be able to protect people's paychecks, right? In order to keep paying employees, keep paying for labor, in order to get inventory, in order to get equipment repaired, or whatever it might be. It was for all the businesses that were affected by the restrictions that were being put into place at the time, right? In order to follow guidelines, a lot of businesses were forced to lose sales and forced to lose money. So the government luckily came out with this plan to give out PPP loans and protect people, right? But now these PPP loans are going to be leveraged in a way that makes it so you are going to have to comply with these mandates, or else you will not probably be able to be eligible for any further PPP loans. And the forgiveness on those loans is something else you should definitely be keeping an eye on, because I assure you that you can see some of these guidelines and restrictions change once more and more businesses are not necessarily jumping on board with this whole situation. So understand that the money was given out and put into place first in order to establish a reason for asking for a favor in the future. And that's exactly what they're doing now, and that's why a lot of these businesses are going to start feeling the pinch, because they took a lot of that money, and a lot of that money is forgivable, okay? And understand that they expanded the economic injury disaster loan program with this whole mandate thing in order to give people even more money, up to $2 million now from the original $500,000. And they also streamlined the forgiveness protocols for the PPP loans. So the money is going in tandem with these mandates. And a lot of these businesses would have closed or shut down indefinitely if they did not have the PPP loans originally. So understand that the money is what's helping push this whole mandate thing through the private sector. And they're not going to be able to separate themselves, because at this time, many of those businesses will either never be able to pay back those loans or won't be able to operate without further loans. And the government knows this, and the government's going to utilize that to force more of these procedures on people. So you may work for a company who's not willing to go that extra mile that's being expected of them from the federal government. But how much money have they taken from the federal government, and how far are they willing to push things until they get to a point where they might not be able to pay that back? These are considerations you have to understand now that are being put into place and were already in place before all this began, so that way there was extra leverage, okay? So, wanted to go ahead and mention that, because this is where things are heading and this is how they're getting it done. Now, 20 years ago, a day occurred that was extremely devastating to the United States of America, and we all will remember that day forever. And unfortunately, on this platform, even talking about that day can be problematic sometimes. But what I will say is that it's something we'll never forget. And I am a true-blooded patriot. I love this country, and that's why I'm so frustrated by what's happening right now, and why I felt the need to give you this message. However, I'm trying my best to maintain some kind of calmness in order to have a better message to be put out there, because we all remember my yelling days, and those weren't as fun, okay? So now, listen, 20 years ago this happened. However, one of the products of that entire situation was the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act is something that set up the whole situation for us to be in the position we're in now. And this is where things start to get dangerous. And this is why we need to really pay attention. I'm trying to get this message out to you. And in this video, at the end of the video, I'll link to the videos I'm actually referencing that I made before about some of these concepts. And I want you guys to make sure to check those out if you didn't watch them already, because you can see how this whole thing is unfolding. But the Patriot Act basically allows for a lot of things that all of us felt like weren't allowed, and some people apparently still feel like aren't allowed. And in one of my previous videos, which was prepping can become illegal instantly, a lot of people referenced the Fourth Amendment as being a way to protect ourselves from that situation. Well, it sounds like the Fourth Amendment wouldn't allow for this. Well, the thing is that the Patriot Act has allowed for the Fourth Amendment to go completely to the wayside when it comes to certain protocols related to different groups of what might be labeled as extremists, okay? Obviously, there's other verbiage there that might be utilized as well, which is more, I guess you would say, common. However, we're using the word extremist here because as of now, it's still a little bit easier to get the message out utilizing that. So what I'm trying to say is that because of the Patriot Act, the government no longer has to show proof or reasonable suspicion in order to search your property, in order to search you, depending on what they submit in the courts thereafter. Basically, as long as it meets the bounds of what's within the Patriot Act, the Fourth Amendment no longer applies, okay? So they don't need to even have a reference to you supporting some kind of a foreign power either. And that's an issue as well, because what used to protect Americans was the fact that if it wasn't based on foreign actors, then the Fourth Amendment held up. That was removed in the Patriot Act 20 years ago. So here we are in the aftermath of what occurred on that fateful day, and now we're finally at the point where we're starting to see how all this comes together, why it's so dangerous, okay? So, reasonable suspicion is no longer required by the FBI, which means if there's any reason for them to look into what you have or look into what it is you're doing, they don't need reasonable suspicion because they can attribute what you do to any different group of extremists that they want to, and then utilize that information via the Patriot Act to then conduct a search without any reasonable cause, okay? And the surveillance can also be issued against you based on your First Amendment activities. What I mean by that is that your social media accounts, the books you read, the movies you watch, letters you might send in to editors of books, or whatever it is you do in the sense of the First Amendment, your freedom of speech can be used against you now thanks to the Patriot Act in order to spy on you in any way they see fit. You understand where this is going, okay? And now here's how we're going to kind of wrap this all up, and this is why I want you to pay attention. This is actually the most important part of the video. So if you stuck around this long, thank you for that, but here's what I really need you to understand, okay? Patriotism was used against us 20 years ago due to the emotions that were high because of the event that occurred. And we all had those heightened emotions, and it's completely understandable because most of us, especially those of you watching videos like this, love our country, and we don't want terrible things to happen. However, that patriotism was utilized against us to allow for things like the Patriot Act to come into existence, which basically signed away a lot of our rights in the process because of safety, right? We want to maintain our safety, so we're going to give away a bunch of our rights. At the time, it seemed like something that was necessary and was sold to the American people because patriotism was high and we wanted to do whatever it took to not allow something like that to ever happen again, which of course we can all agree on we do not want to ever happen again. However, 20 years later, we have to watch out for that same strategy, okay? Here's what I'm trying to say, okay? Preparedness is now considered an extremist ideology, all right? Militias and preparedness communities around the country are being labeled as extremist organizations, or that other word that we don't like to say here, okay? Understand that that then opens the door to all those Fourth Amendment violations provided by the Patriot Act to come in and find out what it is you have, what you're doing, or to surveil you at any point in time. Also understand that a lot of this is being pushed in the direction of, you know, how am I going to say this the best way I can? People of a certain race that practice discriminatory practices, okay? God, it's really hard to get around this sometimes, but I'm really trying to say things in just the right way so you guys can hear this message as much as possible. What I mean by that is that people of a certain group that they're being labeled as people who are practicing anything in the sense of discriminatory practices are now also being called out for supporting things that are happening over in Afghanistan. And what they mean by that, and this is on mainstream media, you can look it up, okay? But basically what they're trying to say is that people who are comparing what the Taliban has received in the sense of weaponry and how it's not necessarily reasonable for them to have access to that kind of equipment, while here in the United States, we aren't even allowed to have things like, I don't know, certain trigger systems or anything else related to certain firearms components. But over there, they're getting whatever they want without filling out any paperwork or background checks or anything like that. Now, people who are speaking in that way are being lumped into a group of people who practice discriminatory practices, I'm getting good at saying that now, and are then being labeled as extremists because of that viewpoint. Or the people who are saying things like, look what the Taliban accomplished in the sense of having, you know, small arms equipment and rising up and taking over the government that was in place that they didn't agree with ideologically. And, you know, what could we learn from that? These are things that people are saying out there that you see in comment sections all over this platform. Those people are now being labeled in a certain way. Those people are being put into a certain category that allows for overreach, okay? Understand why this is becoming so dangerous. 57% of the people who have not complied with some of these mandates and restrictions in the sense of changing their medical decisions are white adults. That is something that you also have to consider. There is a group of people in this country that is now being targeted as being the problem. And this dangerous concept that people of a different opinion or a different background or of a different decision when it comes to making decisions about, their own medical ideas. God, this is a lot of work. Those people are the new enemy. And understand that this patriotism that was used 20 years ago in order to establish things that have created a very dangerous situation for us now at this time are going to be used again if things aren't accomplished in a way that those in power decide they need to be accomplished. And what I mean by that is that you can expect a couple different things. One, you can expect a rallying between the people who are very bought into this whole concept with the federal government and whatever it is that they say needs to happen. Those people are going to be sold on the idea that it's patriotic to push for these things because it's coming from the government, which is the United States, right? And therefore, by supporting what they're doing, you're a patriot. And by not supporting it, you're no longer a patriot. So these people will then be emboldened to move forward in the concepts that are no longer patriotic because in their mind, what they're doing will be considered patriotic. The other thing to consider is that, and this is just my opinion, I would keep my eyes out for some kind of an event to occur that would then move people in a direction of patriotism that would allow for more of a power grab similar to what happened with the Patriot Act. Because in that scenario, you have a large group of people who are not jumping on board with everything that's happening right now. And a large part of that group of people are patriots, people who love this country, people who would do what they have to do if it comes to protecting our soil. So who knows what it is that might occur. But let me give you some hypothetical situations here. And it's just something for you to think about. And I want you to really consider this, okay? But let's say something was to happen that had pure blame placed on a foreign entity. Maybe something that was able to spread and something that, required some kind of biological way of stopping it. And if it was considered an act of war and the foreign entity was a known adversary, would you then have the support of the people who aren't on board right now? Because suddenly this becomes an issue of national security, and suddenly it becomes an issue of protecting our homeland against some kind of a foreign threat. That's how the narrative could easily change. Another way that you could look at this is that the people who are already bought in will then buy in even harder. They'll utilize those people's supposed patriotism to basically target everyone else who doesn't agree. And then those people, your neighbors, will be the reason for why you'll be violated in the sense of the Fourth Amendment thanks to the Patriot Act. These are things we really have to watch out for. This is a dangerous path. It doesn't matter your background, it doesn't matter your ideology, left, right, liberal, conservative. I don't care. None of that matters to me. I don't care if you're pro or anti. What I do care is that we maintain the freedom of choice. We maintain the freedom of privacy. And I do care that we maintain the freedom to decide for ourselves if we want to be part of what's happening. And we're no longer in a situation where that's being allowed. And yes, you might have the personal decision to make in the sense of no longer receiving an income or not working for a certain entity any longer, but that only goes so far. And once enough people have lost their income, lost their ability to operate within society, you create a large swath of people who are desperate. And desperation breeds even more danger. And then this path, this cycle just continues. So this is a very difficult situation we find ourselves in today. And it's not where we want to be. 20 years ago, we were united as a country. And regardless of what all occurred, we knew that back then we were Americans and that we supported each other and that we had to do something in order to make sure things didn't happen like this again. Now we're in a different place. And now people are no longer treating each other that way. And there is not the same solidarity that we saw 2 decades ago. Which means there's not the same ability for us to stand up as a people and say, we're not doing this, or this isn't right, or this isn't how America's supposed to work. So you need to be ready. Make the decisions you have to make. This isn't going to stop here. Things aren't just going to magically get better. and we're in a bad situation where I can foresee things becoming worse. Like I said, the shark's been jumped. The show will not get better. It only gets worse from here. And the only way for this show to improve is a reboot. And that reboot better have some really good writers and directors on it, or else it's going to be just another failed reboot. So, these are things to consider. I wanted to have this conversation. It was a difficult conversation to have. And I didn't think this was the video I was going to be making today. But after what just happened, and what we need to talk about, this is where we are. So, like I said, if you need anything from me ever, magicpepper.com. Let me know your thoughts. Leave comments below. Let's have a conversation. Keep an eye on how you're using your language, and keep an eye on what you're doing out there. Because all I'm trying to tell you is that say whatever you want. Freedom of speech is here. I guarantee you that. However, that Patriot Act, that can come back to bite you anytime it wants. So, without anything else to say about where we are and why things are going to get more dangerous from here, that's going to be it for Magic Pepper.